seems that this also works. Yeah.
Καλημέρα. 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 Ναι, αυτό είναι εντάξει. Δηλαδή, αν δεν το βάλω εδώ. Καλημέρα. Αν δεν το βάλω εδώ, δεν. Αν είναι από εδώ, ενώ το άλλο έχει πολύ καλύτερη απόδοση. Ένα, δύο, ένα, δύο, ένα, δύο.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this plenary. It is a great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session, Professor Dag Haug from the University of Oslo. It gives us all in the organizing committee great pleasure indeed for more than one reason. To start with, Dag Haug is a classicist, a scholar of Greek and Latin. His research extending over classical, post-classical, and New Testament Greek, as well as Indo-European syntax and semantics. His interests extend further to the syntax-semantics interface and the semantics of natural languages. He has published extensively on those topics in prestigious journals and publishing houses. Selective reference to his recent work includes the articles The Genesis and Typology of Correlatives in Language, An Unexpected Root Clause in Linguistic Inquiry, and the chapter on agreement in the Handbook of Lexical Functional Grammar. His most recent volumes include the selection and editing of 16 papers from the 2013 Historical Linguistics Conference, as well as the co-editing of the volumes Big Events, Small Clauses, The Grammar of Elaboration, and Relative Chronology in Early Greek Epic Poetry. To add to that, and that's an angle that truly places his research at the forefront, Doug's expertise extends into the domain of digital humanities and the rendering of classical and linguistic theoretical scholarship into databases and tree banks. He is currently involved in two related projects. The project Deimos, database of Mycenaean Greek at Oslo, unique as far as we know, which aims to create a complete, annotated, accessible, and searchable corpus of all texts in linear B. And the project Universal Natural Language Understanding that develops methods for constructing machine-readable semantic representations of natural language on the basis of syntactically parsed texts. Professor Haug has also published extensively in this domain. Recent publications including post-classical Greek and tree banks for diachronic analysis with our own Nikos Lavidas in a De Gruyter volume, tree banks in historical linguistic research, and rule-based semantic interpretation for universal dependencies. Today, he will talk about universal and definite when clauses in Indo-European and beyond, a study in token-based typology. Please welcome Professor Dag Haug.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to come here and speak to you. This talk is based on recent work I've been doing with Oleg Belyayev and on ongoing work I'm doing with Nido Petracini, who's here in the room. So it's about when clauses, but I will start out with relative clauses. Is this okay, sound-wise? Okay, can you hear me? Yeah? Not so good? Okay, I'll try. So if you look at the typology of relative clauses as it's represented in some of the online databases, you see features like this. Can the relative clause follow the noun? Can it precede a noun? Are there internally headed relative clauses? Are there correlative relative clauses? Are there non-adjacent relative clauses? So those are structural features, syntactic features. The picture is the same if we go to walls, which has these features and a bit more. So it's about what you can relativize on, etc. So a lot of structure and syntax, but basically no semantics in there, in those databases. And I think the reason is clear. In a lot of typological work, you don't always get to the semantics because some of those distinctions are very fine and hard to grasp. They don't make it into reference grammars always, and therefore they also don't make it into typological work based on those reference grammars. So I think that's the reason, and it's not at all because, for example, the semantics of relative clauses is too boring. Because there are things going on. And one thing that will be of importance today is the fact that some of these relative clause structures are maximalizing, have a maximalizing semantics, meaning, as I'll show with some examples here. So first from English. So if you, in English, you can have these structures if you insert this there, right? So that there was on the table into the relative clause. Then that results in a maximalizing relative clause that can only take the kind of determiner that will range over the whole set. So I took every book that there were on the table, that there was on the table. I took the books that there were on the table, but not I took some books that there were on the table, etc. So because the relative clause needs to denote the whole set of books on the table. And you find similar things in other languages. So in Ossetic, you have a correlative structure, which is also maximalizing. So more or less the structure of the sentence is, which girl you gave flowers, I saw her, right? And this can only mean I saw the girl to which you gave flowers, and not a girl to which you gave flowers. If you want to express that meaning, you have to say, the girls that you gave flowers, I saw one of them, right, with a positive construction. So even though in principle, an indefinite interpretation should be available for this kind of noun phrase in Ossetic, it doesn't get that. Now, maximality can be realized in two distinct ways. So it's either definiteness or universal quantification. So Dayal illustrated this with examples from English. So if you say, I ordered what he ordered for dessert, that's a definite reference to the thing he ordered for dessert. But if you say, do what the babysitter tells you, it's everything the babysitter tells you. Right? So it's a quantificational structure. But you can already see these distinctions are, subtle, and you wouldn't always get to them in reference grammar. So it's not easy to study cross-linguistically, and I know this because we tried. We did this in our paper on correlatives. Looked at reference grammars for all languages that we could find with correlatives and tried to, kind of express both these meanings or not. I'll get back to that word, but before I do that, I'll move on to what I'm really talking about today, which is temporal adverbial clauses. So, temporal adverbial clauses can be introduced by items that make explicit some temporal relation, right? So before, something happened before something else, something happened after something else, some state of affairs is ongoing until some point, and there are all these ways of making temporal relations explicit. But there's also good cross-linguistic evidence for a sort of unspecified category, which I'll just refer to as when, capital letters when, which anchors one event to the other, but the exact temporal relation is left to inference based on things like event types, aspect, actionsart, etc. So again, to illustrate with examples from English, you can have things like when John saw Mary, he crossed the street. So he first sees Mary and then he crosses the street to get away from her. Or when John wrecked the Pinto, he broke his arm. So that's complete coincidence, right? During wrecking the Pinto. And even things like when the Smiths threw a party, they invited all their friends, where the invitation obviously precedes the throwing of a party. Or maybe could be conceived as part of it, but still you see that the temporal relations you get with when can vary a lot. And many languages, as we learned from Martinez's dissertation, many languages have a means of expressing this sort of underspecified temporal relation. And what's interesting is that, again, here in these when clauses, we get the definite universal distinction back again. So when English doesn't make it in this case, right? So when I went to bed, I took a long time to sleep. In principle, there would be two interpretations. When I went to bed yesterday, I took a long time to sleep, so referring to a definite event in the past and anchoring another event to that. Or it can be a sort of quantified structure. When I went to bed, I usually took a long time to sleep. Right? So every time I went to bed. So in English, we don't see this. There's only when. But in other languages, in German and Norwegian, you would lexicalize this. Right? There is a difference. So there are two different complement types of this. In German, there's als and when. And in Norwegian, there's da and no. And as we'll see, this distinction is actually made in quite a number of languages in the world. which is interesting because it hasn't been much discussed. So there's some discussion in the formal semantic literature, a couple of papers, typically also discussing the fact that these universal when clauses they're also related to conditionals. Right? I'm going to try to leave that out, but if you know German, you will know that when also means if. And that has interested more people also in the typological literature. But this sort of distinction within the temporal domain between definite and universal is less discussed. So in typology, the only book I found about this is where this is mentioned is Kortman 1997, where he works on European languages, and you basically cannot avoid this if you have Germanic, because a lot of Germanic languages do make this distinction. But we'll see that it's much more widespread. And the reason I started with relative clauses is that there is this connection between temporal clauses and relative clauses, and especially the when kind of temporal clause. So this is again something we see from Martinez's dissertation, that this unspecified when is very often expressed with a construction that is either is a relative clause, a straight relative clause, or something very closely related to a relative clause. So it can be a relative clause with a temporal noun, or it could be some sort of headless relative clause, or free relative clause, which is a common analysis of English when, right? You can treat them as headless relative clauses. But you also find correlative constructions and other sorts of related constructions. And also, very clear from this work, it's much more frequent to find this relative clause origin for the when relation than for these other, before or after temporal relations that he also studies. Here's just an example with a relative clause. So which time Aslam came, that time. So we have a correlative structure. And that's how we say when. Okay, so now I get to what I'm going to try to do today. We've seen that there is this universal definite contrast in both relative clauses and in when clauses. And we've seen that when clauses are often very similar to relative clauses. So can we make a connection? And the connection I'm gonna, so can we apply what we know about universal definite contrast in the domain of relative clauses? Can we transfer that to when clauses? So what do we know about universal definite contrasts in relative clauses? Well, we tried, we think we succeeded in our 2020 paper to demonstrate that there's a correlation between the morphology and the origin of in correlative clauses of the relativizer and this universal definite distinction. And then the question will be, is there something similar to be found for when clauses? So, just going to summarize what we did in this 2020 paper. We demonstrated so universal, very few languages have correlatives or are described as having correlatives. So it's universal in scare quotes here. But the idea was that you can classify those correlative languages based on the morphology of the relativizer. And there are two main sources. So either it's a WH word, so an interrogative, typically also serving as an indefinite, or it's some sort of demonstrative stem. I'll show examples. And then the semantic distinction is the one I just been talking about, universal versus definite. And what we try to support is that WH-based correlative structures, where you have WH word doing the relativization, will always have a universal reading. It may also have a definite reading, which may be morphologically marked. If it's based on a demonstrative stem, it will always have a definite reading. It may also have a universal reading, and that may be morphologically marked. So examples. So from Bambara, here you have, so what man bought a knife, I saw him, is the correlative structure. So, and the correlativizer here, min, is a demonstrative. And the reading is definite, right? So I saw the man who bought a knife. In Hungarian, you have examples. Again, the correlative structure. Here without, well, it's more like a free correlative clause. So who Maori loves, that person should invite to the party. So the relativizer is a WH word, also used in interrogatives, and the reading of the correlative structure is universal. Right, so here is whoever Maori loves, she invited to the party. So we went to grammars of languages with correlatives, and we wanted to see whether the data support this. And it turns out to be quite good evidence for. There turns out to be quite good evidence for this. So among these are numbers from languages with WH-based correlatives. Point here. So you see that there are 8 of them where the correlative has both universal and a definite reading. But there are 16 of those languages with WH-based correlatives where it only has a universal reading and no definite reading, as described in the grammars of those languages. There are 2 potential exceptions here, Tamil and Dagva. Those are languages that have multiple WH constructions, and we think those originated as one, and they've been sort of separated to make the readings explicit. But the structure is different enough that we counted them as 2 different constructions. And obviously there's nothing here because it has to have some reading, right? It's either universal or definite. So that's quite convincing, we think. And similarly, or even perhaps better for the demonstrative-based correlatives, they seem to always have a definite reading and never have a universal reading. So I should say that these numbers are only based on the structures as described in the grammars, but there's no special marking, right? So a lot of these languages with demonstrative-based correlatives can get a universal reading, so for the correlative, so it could be here, but that would require some marking. So either you put in conditional marking, or you put in a subjunctive mood, or some sort of generalizing morphology, habituality, things like that. Okay, so we think there's a diachronic explanation for this pattern that we see, namely that demonstrative-based correlatives originate in parataxis. So the original structure is something like that man bought a knife, I saw him, and these sort of fuse into one clause, and obviously that will give you the definite reading, right? Because you have this demonstrative pronoun, you'll get a reference to the demonstrative, to definite individual. And for WH correlatives, so the explanation here is Gibbon's explanation for the demonstrative-based correlatives, but the similar story won't work for the WH-based correlatives. So we think there's something else going on, and it's related to the fact that WH words in a lot of the world's languages, and specifically we tested in these languages where we have WH correlatives, also has an indefinite use. Right? So who can also mean someone, right? And the structure is that of a paratactic conditional. So a conditional structure with and, right? So man brings it back and he shall own it, can be interpreted as a conditional, right? In many. So this is perhaps not a very good example, but you know, you buy one more beer and I'll leave, right? That's a conditional interpretation of a coordinate structure, and we think that's what's going on here. So in those clauses, you have an indefinite. And you get obligatorification of this sort of anaphoric connection between the 2 clauses, and the conditional gives you the quantificational structure. So that's what we think is the origin of these WH correlatives. This is an old explanation, actually. So it's found in literature going back to Delbrück. For Slavic, he said this is the origin of correlative structures with kto. And this will predict then that the universal reading is primary, right? Because we have a conditional structure, this gives you the quantification with this indefinite, with the WH word interpreted as an indefinite. Now there are these diachronic paths between these, because the readings coincide in many cases. If just unique reference, you can't tell the difference between quantifying over a singleton domain or a definite interpretation. And also with plurals. And whenever there's genericity and habituality, which you'll often have to mark in special ways. And this gives rise to these marking asymmetries. Typically, you don't need any special marking to make the WH indefinite become definite, because a lot of these languages don't have any special morphology for definites. Whereas this reinterpretation of demonstratives as quantifying structures will typically require morphology. And as I mentioned, it's either conditional marking or habituality that we see, or some sort of generalizing structure. Okay, so with that in mind, that we did on correlatives, we come to when clauses. They're harder to study, I think, than correlatives, because there's so many ways this what you can think of as a when clause can be realized, right? So we've seen this, something similar to relative clauses. You can have converbs, you can have subordinated adverbial clauses. There are other strategies, and they have this vague semantics. I already told you that temporal relation can differ, but also more difficult maybe is that in many cases a when clause is sort of truth conditionally at least equivalent to just juxtaposing two main clauses. Right? So when Chris came home, she had a cup of tea. Means the same as Chris came home, she had a cup of tea. There's a difference in how we package the information, etc., but it basically describes the same state of affairs. So it's hard to come up with a useful comparative concept to capture these without including main clause juxtaposition, and then you basically have everything. So to mitigate that, we're trying to apply this method of token-based typology, exploring massive parallel corpora. So this is ongoing work. We started from the translation of the English when. So we started from the English Bible, from the English word when, and we're looking at how that is expressed, translated, in the 1,444 languages in the Bible corpus of Meyer and Sisau. The basic assumption underlying this work is that if there are two instances of when, two different Bible verses with when in them, where across languages you typically use the same word, that means those are semantically similar. Whereas if many languages make a distinction there, use different words, those are different in meaning. And then there's a lot of stuff going on with statistics and to produce semantic maps. But if you want to hear more about that, you can come to Nilo's talk at 11:30, right? So right after the poster session, there will be more details. For now, here I'm just going to give you the maps, and I'm not going to talk more about how we produce them. But here's the raw semantic map of when that we get out of this method, right? So we're looking at the translations of when in these languages, and we get this picture. We don't have any labels, unlike previous studies using this kind of techniques. We don't have any labels, right? Because we all we know is that each of these data points, each of these is a Bible verse, and you can think of it as a representation of how that particular Bible verse with when in it is translated across these 1,400 languages. But without labels, there's not so much we can say about this, right? I mean, it's just a picture. So what can we do? Well, we can label each data point with the translations into a specific language. And this is what we're going to do. And in particular, here, we're going to use German, because German makes this distinction that we're interested in, right? So, and if we do that, we get this. So the red area here is alles. So Bible verses where German uses alles. The yellow ones up here are verses where you get wenn. And you see there are other strategies as well. So you sometimes get da, and you get und, of course, then representing coordination or main clause juxtaposition. And you also get null, which can mean in principle either that the statistics didn't find an equivalent, or in many cases also that the language uses a strategy that is not lexicalized. Right? You don't have a lexical item, because we're only picking up on lexical items here. So it could be some sort of adverbial converb or something like that, and it will end up in that category. But what you see is that with this method, we can quite clearly separate cases where you make the universal definite, cases of universal when from cases of definite when, right? So we find those pretty easily. And now we can compare, given that we know what this German distinction between the yellow and the red area are about, we can now compare with other languages. languages, right? And this is what we get. So here are some select languages that also make the distinction. That you can see these are quite similar, right? So there's Sranan Tongo. So that's a Creole from Suriname. And there we have Tikuna, also from South America, Hiligaynon, Austronesian, and Delo from Atlantic Congo. So you can see that these three are very similar to German, right? The distinction you make is very similar. There's some difference in detail, but globally speaking, we think this is the same category. And Delo is different in that you have this distinction in this upper domain, but then you have a lot of null constructions, probably indicating there's something going on with converbs or something similar. But anyway, this shows you that a wide variety of languages have this distinction, and we can also illustrate it better by looking at each language, picking the item that is most similar to German when, and plotting how precise it is as an equivalent of German when. So in a sense here, we're doing something a little bit stupid because to interpret the data, right, we just have to pick one language where we know what the category is about, and then we compare the others to that language. Of course, it would be better if there was a more data-driven way of getting to a linguistic category, but that's ongoing work. Anyway, you see that German is a perfect representative of German. And then some usual suspects, like SWG, that's Swabian German, so it's a little bit different. But then here are the interesting languages, right? You can't actually tell them apart, but we can also plot them on a map. And then it's not so easy to see, but up here in the Germanic languages, you have a lot of languages making this distinction, Germanic. And then there's a lot of it in Indonesia and the Philippines, also quite common there, and on some of the scattered Pacific islands. West Africa is another region where we get quite a number of languages making this distinction. And in America it's rarer, in some cases in South America. And in North America it's basically non-existent, except for Pennsylvania German and Plattdeutsch up here, right? So, I mean, it's none of the real American languages. Okay. We see that there's a widespread distinction between definites and universals in when clauses. And I told you in correlatives, we know this is morphologically motivated, and the research question is, this is also the case in when clauses. So if we translate what Oleg and I did for correlatives, we'd get something like this. If the subordinate is based on an indefinite interrogative stem, it can always express universal when, and it can also express definite when, which may require special marking. This is the one I'm going to focus on. So I'll skip number 2, because it's harder. So it's for future work. So that means, in a sense, right, are they all like Norwegian? Are all these languages like Norwegian, right? I would ask, right? Wouldn't I? So because Norwegian is a perfect representative of this, in the sense that it has a nor, which is identical to the interrogative, and it has the universal reading, right? And there's da, which is from a demonstrative stem, and it has the definite reading. Of course, the way our generalization is stated, you could also satisfy it trivially by just making no distinction, right? Those languages are, in a sense, not relevant. And, of course, most languages don't have these when clauses related to relatives at all, etc. So we're talking about, a little set of languages that may just be like Norwegian. Right, yeah, so that's what I just said. We should also say that we have in mind the same diachronic explanation that we have for correlative clauses, which means, of course, that there could be more stuff going on. We'll actually see that in Greek. So that's so we're not arguing that the obligation words are sort of have some universal, some semantics that make the universal meaning basic. That could also play in, but that's not really the explanation we have in mind. So with that in mind, we're going to look with some detail at Indo-European languages and how this distinction plays out in Indo-European, using some traditional methods, because they're good grammars and easily accessible for me. But for these other languages, I'm going to do a more data-driven approach, because it's often very hard to find that information about the etymology of the items, right, and what semantics they have, we can get from our maps, but the morphology, which is crucial, it's not so easy because for many of these languages I've not been able to find grammars. So, should mention, because I'm talking about WH origins for temporal clauses, there's also these WH words of manner that can give rise to temporal clauses, right? So German wie and French comme, so comme je descendais des fleuves impassibles, as I was, right? This is comme is from, I mean, it's identical to the interrogative historically, right? So it's from Latin quo modo, it's how, but it gives a definite reading. And then there's in German, wie sie einem Herrn graben wurden, when they got angry with a man. So that's universal. And wie is the how interrogative, right? So what we see, these may behave differently, right? So now I'm looking at subordinate clauses introduced by the interrogative of when, right? And not the interrogative how. These are different. They may even be closer to definite when. I don't know exactly what's going on. But they're part of the bigger picture here, but I'm not going to look at them. So for when in Indo-European, when clauses, we know that subordinate structures in Indo-European probably arose from correlative structures. You can see that for temporal adverbial clauses in Vedic. But the connection between when and relative stem holds also in languages where there are no correlatives. But the point is that the relative stem that is being used can vary, right? So some Indo-European languages will use something based on demonstrative stem, and others will use the interrogative stem. So what we need to know now is whether that maps onto the semantic distinction. Got a lot of data here, and I'm going to go a little bit light on them. But basically, Greek and Vedic have these demonstrative stem-based words. In their base use, they're definites, and then they typically require extra marking. So in Greek, you can see this very well. If you want to express the universal reading, you have the subordinator hota, based on the demonstrative stem, but you need to have an and the subjunctive. So you add morphology to make it a generalizing structure. Requires special morphology. So if you don't do that, the Greek examples I should look at since we're in Greece, right? So this is Mycenaean. You have hota here, right? And it refers to a definite event, right? When the king appointed Augevas as Damokoros, right? Fine. You want to generalize, you want to express universal when. You need to put in this modal particle, so it's hota plus an, and a subjunctive, right? So on its own, this when word from the demonstrative stem cannot do universal when, right? It has to be accompanied by a special modal particle and a subjunctive. That's the take-home message. Just going to talk a little bit as an aside about the further development, because it shows how diachrony can mess up these things. Because hota and the modal particle an, they fuse into one word hotan, right? That still looks like it's based on the demonstrative stem, but now it can obviously express universal when. And in fact, this now gives rise to a lexicalized distinction. There's hota and hotan, right? Which we can pick up because they're two different lexical items, but only because those two fused. And then hotan replaces hota, and now we have only hotan or hotan in modern Greek, right? Although in a Bible translation we find both, but only because it's an archaizing Bible translation. But this shows you how something that looks like it's based on the demonstrative stem can still end up being universal. Okay. Now I'm just going to contrast. So Greek and Vedic on one side has these demonstrative-based clauses, and they require special morphology, generalizing subjunctives and similar things to get to universal reading. And Latin is the opposite. It has the quo stem, And there's no generalizing subjunctive. Indeed, there's no generalizing subjunctive really in Latin at all. So that's an interesting difference in the uses of mood here, right? So this one can do universal readings. And interestingly, in the related languages, Sabellic languages, Oscan, Umbrian, it can almost only do universal readings. Although the evidence is scarce, so interpret with care. But we see there's this contrast, right? It's basically playing out in the way we think it should. And even more interesting is that there's innovation going on, right? So, because cum in Latin is from the interrogative stem, but it's not the when word. It's not how you ask when. Right? There's another word that's quando. That's how you ask when. And that's a more recent thing in Latin, not in the related languages. But it develops a use as subordinator. Also has this indefinite use, some when. And is almost only universal. Right? So when you see the innovation, so when you have a new word coming in, an interrogative being recruited as the subordinator, what happens is that it's almost only universal. So that's what we see in early Latin, and then it reappears in Romance, and then it has developed both readings. So that's con, quando, etc. Okay. There's something similar going on here. I'm not going to do all the details, but in Hittite, you have this indefinite kuwapi, meaning, it's when and it's some when, and it develops its use as also subordinating when. And interestingly, you can show that it's actually used for generic temporal clauses with a conditional nuance. So again, new items coming in from the interrogative system being used as subordinators, and they only have this universal reading. Slavic is probably I'm gonna maybe, okay. So what happens here is that you replace, so you can see very well in Slavic that the relatives and the subordinates, fit together. You used to have this ye-based things, and then you switch the whole system to the k stem. But that has already happened, no, it's not already happened. No, it's a development between the older Slavic texts and the later ones, but I'm not aware of any study whether it starts out with a universal reading. So in that sense, doesn't provide data for us here. But it leads up to Baltic, where you have the converse situation, where the replacement has already happened. So in Baltic, you have kada, for example, Lithuanian kada, it's when, and it also will be the relativizing and subordinating function. But if you look into the details, as someone did 100 years ago, you can see that in the earliest instances, so Hermann describes this in terms of German. He says, it almost never means als, it almost always means when, German when. So again, WH word based on the interrogative and only having a universal reading. And instead, if you want to do als, he says, you have to use kaip or kat or the other constructions. In the oldest Lithuanian. That's no longer the case as far as I know in modern Lithuanian. So kada has won out, as happens a lot in these Indo-European languages. That the distinction is given up. But what we see here is that in the earliest developments, you can see exactly the pattern that fits with our hypothesis. So there's clear evidence for priority of universal when for this WH-based form. Old Irish, I think I'm gonna skip and then go to English, which is interesting because Old English has a system based on demonstrative stem. So there's ta and there's tona. It makes the distinction, right? So there's definite reading tha and universal reading tona based on the demonstrative stem. It's not really clear what goes on, how these developed. They're already there from the oldest text. Presumably go back to relative structures. And then there's interrogative when, which is wanna, which is the modern English when, which also had an indefinite use. Could also mean some when, and starts being used to introduce temporal subordinate clauses in Old English. But crucially, again, only in universal contexts. And again, we're lucky enough for the Indo-European languages that these very detailed descriptions of the history And people have shown that the WH word takes over in universal context. So it starts out only meaning universal when, or German when, where ta is maintained longer. And basically, the story is the same in German, except the WH word was never generalized. So if we sum up the Indo-European part, they support our generalization. I mean, often trivially, in that there's just no distinction being made. But if you look more carefully on the historical data, you can see that, yes, the WH ones, well, the demonstrative-based ones do need special marking to express the universal reading. And these new forms that keep being innovated based on the relative stem, the WH stem, start out in the domain of universal when, which is exactly what we think. So it's the same pattern that we see with correlatives. We need to look more into the diachronic pathways. We think it's basically the same thing going on as we suggested for correlatives, but of course this is then part of a whole system shift in many of these languages, right? So in English, it's not only the case that ton gets replaced by when, but of course also these other relative words based on the demonstrative stem. You get relative pronouns who, etc. Yeah, thank you. So the whole system shifts from demonstratives into WH words. Okay. Now, if we want to do something similar outside of Indo-European, that's hard, right? Because there's a lot of historical, semantic, etymological work that you need to do. But for the semantics we've seen, we have these computational approximations, right? So universal when corresponds to, I mean, we can just look at how well it fits with German when. Definite when means it corresponds to als. But then when we want to look at the etymology, there's no good, computational way of saying in this language that I have no idea about, does it correspond to a demonstrative stem, right? We just can't do that. Yeah. I mean, we need linguists to do that, which is good. But then for WH-based ones, we can do something because, again, German comes to the rescue. It's the secret hero of this talk. Yeah, I mean, it makes a distinction, right? I mean, so there's when, I said it's from the WH stem, but there's also one, right? Which is the interrogative, right? So we can see whether it's an interrogative or a subordinator. So that means we can look through the languages and see whether they correspond to one, and then we know whether it's the same. The subordinator is also the interrogative word, right? Now there are only 14 instances of one in the gospel. They don't ask much about when some things happen, but that's enough. So what we can do is that we can look at the words interrogatives and see whether they correspond to one, and then we can look whether it's also used as a subordinator, right? We can do this at various thresholds. We can take a liberal view and say that if it's once the case that it translates German one, then it is an interrogative. That's a bit too liberal, maybe. We can go the opposite way and say that it has to translate all the 14 cases of German 1. Then we get only 5 Indo-European languages and 1 Uralic language that I don't forget, and we get Klingon. This is Klingon in the Bible corpus of CISO. That's a surprise, but yeah. But what I'm going to do is to take an intermediate stance and say that if there are 7 cases where it translates German 1 or corresponds to German 1, then I'm going to count it as identical, having an interrogative use. So if we do that, and then we look at the correspondence to when and als to know whether it has a definite reading or universal reading, these are the numbers we get. So they look good. There are 46 cases of subordinators, subordinators that are also used as interrogatives, and they have universal and definite readings. But there are 21 cases of subordinators that are also interrogatives that only have a universal reading and no definite reading, according to this metric. And there's one counterexample, which I'll get back to, because it's also interesting. I should say that 7 of those 21 languages are Indo-European, And it's not always clear that this computational method picks up the best when equivalent. So again, I think there's just no substitute for real linguistics here, but it's nice to discover the pattern. I'm going to show you one convincing example. So here there is, so that's Querabo, Seni, where you have so for universal when you have Vati, which is also the interrogative, also translates German 1, of course also German 1, and then there's Vatu down here. But those are obviously related, so if someone actually knows that language, I would love to talk to you and hear what you think about that. But the pattern is what we expect in the sense that the word that is identical, the subordinator that is identical to the interrogative, only has the universal reading. And there are a few more maps like that, but before I show them, I really like to find language experts to talk to who actually know those languages. I said there was one counterexample, and that's a Spanish-based Creole Chavacano from the Philippines, where you have cuando, which is obviously the interrogative, and it's only used for definite when. That should be definite when, sorry about that. So the interrogative word only used for definite when and not for universal when. And what you do for universal when is si and al. Now, I think this is a case maybe where there was a distinction. You remember in the Philippines, this distinction is very common. So I think it's a case where the lexifier language, so you recruited items from the lexifier language of the Creole to express distinctions that were there in the substrate languages. So there's no grammaticalization process, obviously, of cuando in itself. Okay, of cuando in itself, but it happens, so to speak, during creolization. So here's the pattern that I'd like to show. We have, so here is cuando, right? Opposite of what we'd expect is definite when, although it's in the interrogative. But you see that some of these substrate languages, so Tagalog and Hiligaynon, make these distinctions, and even more languages in the Philippines makes this distinction. So I think what happened is that they're just grabbing stuff, you know, lexical items from the Spanish, where we have cuando and al, and to express that distinction, right? So it doesn't follow this pattern of grammaticalization that we otherwise observe. Okay, so summary, I think there's moderately positive results for these WH-based subordinators. There are no real counterexamples if we think the Chavacano case is special. There are good evidence for this from Indo-European, and there's, the non-Indo-European cases are rare and preliminary, but there are some good cases. So, demonstrative-based subordinators require much more work, as I said, because these historical facts and etymologies are very impenetrable for the computational methods. And we should also really get a better way of reconstructing interpretable concepts rather than, you know, I've been grabbing German concepts all the time, and that's really not the best way to do it. But that's future work, and I think that there's promising things there. And I think this token-based data-driven approach from translations is really useful to find those distinctions, and then you need to do more work to get to the real thing. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop there.
There's just time for a couple of quick questions for Professor Haug. Yep.
Thank you very much for the informative talk. That was some things I never thought about before. I'm a speaker of German, and it made me think the definite universal distinction actually breaks down in the future, or is neutralized in the future. So you probably didn't want to overwhelm us so early in the morning, but you didn't talk about tense. Did you find any generalizations there?
Yes, so, okay, good, thanks for the question. So that's one of the, you know, I put up some questions here that one could ask, because this universal definite interpretation distinction is not very well studied. And there are lots of things you can ask. And yeah, in particular, other languages where you make this contrast in the future. And we don't see that in the maps, yeah, I think we need to do more careful work, because also these maps try to collapse a lot of distinctions onto 2 dimensions, and yeah, maybe we need, maybe you can tease out some distinctions, but so far we've not found that, right? It's really in the past that it happens, and then in the present, obviously, it will be generic and universal. Yeah. But yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
At a certain point, you said that present-day English is irrelevant. It would only be when, and it has both readings. However, in present-day English, there's also whenever.
Whenever, yeah.
Is like when. It has extra morphological material. In the spirit of your talk, you would expect that whenever goes for a definite reading, and it goes for the other reading. Doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm not sure I quote, but yes, sure. So you can, if you, when you collapse the distinction, right, as English is done, then you might want to recruit new items to express the distinction again, right, and make it explicit. For example, universal reading by having ever, right? So these are cycles in a sense, right? If the distinction collapses, you might want to add more morphology to express it again. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for this talk. I would like to hear your opinion about languages having non-finite subordination strategies. So since, I mean, clearly for Indo-European, your approach works quite well, and I'm fine with the data and so on and so forth. But if we have it as a comparative concept, this universal definite distinction and so on, so how could we deal with non-finite subordination, and how can we say something about it, since the etymological stuff is basically missing there then?
Yeah. No, that's, I mean, that's an obvious weakness of this method, right? You can only pick up on distinctions that correspond to lexical items, right? So if the non-finite subordination is also not indicated by some complementizer, which it often will not, right? Then there is just no way you will pick it up this way. However, you can see interesting things in languages. Yeah, I could have shown you some maps, but we get maps where it's all null, right? So basically we didn't find anything. But of course, there are also many languages where you have competition between finite and non-finite subordination. And then you get interesting maps where this null construction is found in a particular area, right? So which means that these maps do pick up on a distinction that many languages make, where they have sometimes used lexicalized constructions and sometimes not. And it's typically the same across the world's languages, actually. So null, if I find one. Right. So here's Tagalog. I mean, I don't know Tagalog. I should have picked a language I know, but anyway. Down here is null, right? Which might indicate non-finite subordination used in those cases. And the interesting thing is that across the languages, even though the model doesn't know that null in Tagalog is identical to null in ancient Greek, you will find it in the same area. It's really here, stretching out from here. So there's sort of an implication of universal in the sense that we do identify here area where non-finite subordination is particularly likely to be used. But if there's only non-finite subordination in the language, then we get nothing with these methods.
Thank you. We have to move on now. Okay.
Perhaps it's just a quick one. I would like to ask about the meaning of the dots in the plots. Why are they treated as continuous variables? I mean, the translations of Van and Als.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Is it now better? So I would like to ask about the meaning of the dots in the plots, and why are they treated as continuous variables? So the translations of Van and Als in the respective languages, how do you assign values to those dots? Mm-hmm.
So when we compare, maybe the best place to start with that is here. when and als are obviously the discrete variable, right? But there are many cases. So if I take Norwegian nor and da, basically makes the same distinction. What I do with nor is I look at the areas where Norwegian uses nor. Do they all correspond to German when? Are there no cases where it corresponds to German da or als? And that will be the precision, right? That percentage. And then the recall is how many of the German cases of when are covered by Norwegian nor, right? So that gives you the opposite percentage, right? So how precise is nor as an equivalent of when, and how many of the whens does it recall? And that gives you, recall and precision. English is going to have perfect recall, right? Because English when covers all cases of German when, because there's only English when in the corpus, right? So perfect recall. And then we take the harmonic mean of those two to get what is called an F1 score, and that's what we're using, for example, in this heat map. Yeah.